But I'll tell you what they don't want. They don't want a population of citizens capable of critical thinking. They don't want well-informed, well-educated people capable of critical thinking. They're not interested in that. That doesn't help them. That's against their interest.
To tell what I knew of activities which I believe might lead to an attempt to set up a fascist dictatorship.
Now, to go on to the word fascism, I would describe the type of government into which we have evolved as essentially fascist, yes.
It lays the predicate and the foundation for the development of a weather satellite that will permit man to determine the world's cloud layer and ultimately to control the weather, and he who controls the weather will control the world.
Trust the experts, trust the experts. Trust the science, trust the science. CDC, CDC, Dr. Fauci. Mask on, mask off, 2 shots, 1 shot, mask on, 2 masks. Comply.
Welcome to the Exit Your Matrix show, where we take the deep dive in search of truth. On the journey, we examine critical topics such as natural law, consciousness, morality, individual sovereignty, and the occult. And here's your host, Brad Villers. Hello and welcome to episode 6 of the Exit Your Matrix show. Thanks for being with me. So before we get into today's topic, which is magic and sorcery, you probably didn't see that one coming. I certainly wasn't expecting it. But I want to reveal for you here a portion of a lecture given by Manly P. Hall. And I've quoted him in the last episode and will continue to.
You will gradually recondition your own ambitions. The greatest important fusion of good feeling that we have is a marvelous ability to transform ambition into aspiration. Ambition is the personality struggling for its dignities. Aspiration is the soul seeking truth. And this search for reality is finally the great journey of life. Aspiration protects us from selfishness. It protects us from the tyranny of ambition. It protects us from egotism. And it also opens the way to the final reconciliation of all religion. It makes it possible for the individual to see in all faiths paths leading to the final objective, which is the transmutation of the inner life. It is assumed that that which becomes like truth will participate in truth. That which becomes like soul will become soul. And that which is like God will ultimately become one with God. Anything that leads away from these basic achievements is not good.
So in any case, I thought that was a thought-provoking way of starting the show. So I just want to go back and cover some material that we've talked about before. First of all, if you're joining me for the first time, I would suggest that you go back and start at show number 1. It really will help because we're laying foundational ground here and covering basic concepts that we need to build upon before we can tackle things like universal truth, natural law, objective morality, and all these kinds of things. We will get there, but we have to go back through and repeat some of this information and make sure we have a firm understanding of these key concepts. So, first and foremost, do your own thinking. That's what this show is all about. Whatever conclusion you come to is your own. I would certainly hope that you would come to certain conclusions over others, but that's for you to decide. My feeling is that if you're able to truly open your mind, that this process will really evolve. And if you give into it, it will naturally happen. So the most important battle for me is not in the accepting or the rejecting of any particular information or theory or concept. It's really opening up and cultivating our own minds to get the mind in the position and in the condition it needs to be in to be able to contemplate really anything, whether it's those things or others. So, what I'm really trying to say is, I think truth is a byproduct of the process of freeing the mind. And I've come up with, I think, is a decent framework for being able to list out and show, kind of actually give a little bit of a roadmap as to what these particular features are. So let's go ahead and talk through those really quickly. Number one, as we've said, do your own thinking. Absolutely critical. Number two, exercise discernment. And in this, I specifically mean the sources of information and the quality and type and variety of information that you're taking in. Number three, practice pedestal thinking. This is just a kind of a common way of me saying being able to put something up on a pedestal like you see in a museum, and you can walk around it and get a 360-degree view and have no emotional attachment to it one way or the other, just be able to see it as it is. Number four, understand cognitive dissonance. This occurs and is the tug, the strife that we feel, the discomfort that we experience when we are acting and thinking in different ways. So this is the conflict of the thoughts, emotions, and actions that we've talked about before. So it's this stress that we feel when those two things are out of alignment. Number five, allow and ultimately welcome anarchy of the mind. So this is just the ability to sit back and let the mind do what the mind will do if it's given the right environment. And then ultimately, after you allow that to happen, you'll welcome it, because it means that you are on the road to a next level of consciousness and likely an awakening. Number six, recognize the impact of conditioning and external influences. This is a critical one. I really don't think we have an idea of how things like our childhood and upbringing, public schooling, I always say public schooling, but schooling in any case, in my opinion, and all of these social influences that we receive, and they're constantly imparting a certain way of thinking into us. And we, over time, adopt those to be our own. And then those become belief systems, whether or not we've actually thought about them or not. And finally, number seven, embrace those 6 magic words, I was wrong and I don't know. One thing that this process does is it really points out the futility of trying to identify the actors or the people or organizations or whatever it might be that are causing all that's going on. And I've said it before, I find it interesting. I have discussions about it with other people, but it's not what I think really defines what's going on. Those individuals or groups or whatever they are simply mechanisms. They're simply tools for something else that's going on. And so we have to understand we are the cause because of our unwillingness to pay attention to and understand ourselves in a way that arms us and keeps us from enduring suffering. But that's inconvenient, so we resort to other explanations. And of course, the number one all-time favorite is politics, right? So I happened to get this gem just from the most recent Epic Times. So I had one from the last episode, and here we have another one. So this particular reader was talking about the Anheuser-Busch Bud Light dust-up and making some really good points. One item here is talking about the sudden move from fossil fuels to a green economy, made this comment. Until they were able to bridge that gap with renewable green resources, what were they thinking? The answer simply is they weren't. Failed leadership is a blind pursuit of an ideal with no plan in place to make it work. I don't know if he was quoting that from someplace, but that's pretty well done. Then we get into the final paragraph, and he begins with this. The only remaining question is, When our national leadership is so equally inept and close-minded that they cannot say, lesson learned, what do we do next? And I was waiting with bated breath, and then he delivered this. That is why we must all vote in 2024. And we can all have our perspectives, but I do not think that politics is the answer, and I think it's just another one of the contrivances that we participate in to make us feel like we are actually in control or have some form of control, which I'm afraid to say we just don't. And I think this paradigm that we're given of Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, all of these dynamics that we're offered are really well represented in this shirt right here. And it's the first time I have seen something like this. By the way, if you want to get one of these, go to thehighersidechats.com. He's got a great merchandise section there and some other great items as well. So a critical awakening to this human condition is that we have and continue to trade personal sovereignty for comfort, or maybe what we would call convenience, and perceived safety. That is just the nature of what we are. And without a constant reminder of that, we can really fall prey to folks who don't have our best interests at heart. And so this process of moving towards truth through the opening of our minds is a revealing of universal, immutable principles like natural law and objective morality. The final item I want to talk about before we get into our recap is I want to revive and refresh the lost art of imagination. I'm a firm believer that even with all the problems that we have and the issues that we're facing, we still have the ability to come together and really apply our consciousness in a way that we aren't now, but we do have that potential. And so I think much more than looking to someone else to rescue us, to provide for us, if we engage our imagination, I believe we can actually start to understand ways to deal with those issues for ourselves. Remembering that repetition is our friend, let's do a review and go back over what we have learned so far. We have talked about truth and the pursuit of truth. Ultimately, what we can say about truth is that it is all that has happened and is currently happening. We also have to understand its nemesis, truth's nemesis, which is solipsism. And this is the mindset that truth cannot be discerned or really known, and that is up to the individual. We see this in the perception is reality mantra. We've also talked about cause and effect, and that there is true cause to effects. My opinion, all too often, we spend so much time talking about the effects and causes that are very proximate to it, but aren't true root causes. Aspects of manifested consciousness. These are the thoughts, emotions, and actions that are part of us as being human beings. Most importantly, we've talked about the importance of those three being in harmony and what results the negative consequences of disharmony. Brain structure and composition. We have the reptilian brain, which is the brain stem, and that is responsible for fight or flight, for primal urges to live and survive. Then the mammalian brain, which introduces emotion. Then we have above that the neocortex or human or thinking brain, and that really allows for us to think in terms of meta, of being able to think about a subject, of being able to ponder our own existence, all of those types of things. And again, imbalance is critical here. Do we have an imbalance to a fight or flight mode where somebody is constantly keyed up, as our society often prompts us to do, and we feel nothing but fight or flight? We have a hard time nuancing what our feelings and emotions and responses should be to something. Left and right brain. We have what I call the black and white brain on the left, which is mathematics, science, very rule-based type applications. And then its counter to the right, which is involved in holistic thinking and creativity and art. And again, Imbalance is the key here. Do we have an imbalance to one or the other? We've also talked about the two primary and primal forces within us, and they are love and fear. And when we experience love, it expands our consciousness. And contrary to that is fear. Fear constricts our consciousness. When love is experienced internally, we call that sovereignty or dominion. And when love experienced or expressed externally, we call that freedom. Fear experienced internally is confusion, and fear expressed or experienced externally is slavery. So let's wrap up the review with our newest subject from last week, which is worldviews, and specifically worldviews that result from significant imbalances to the left or right brain. So if we have a serious and consistent imbalance to the left brain, we have randomness, and this results in order giver or master mindsets and behavior that we'll see in other people. Now, if we see this in enough of the population in the aggregate, this results in social Darwinism. We also have a possible imbalance to the right brain, and if this is consistent and significant enough, it results in determinism. And this is order follower or slave mindsets. And this results in, or can result in, religious extremism and fundamentalism. Now, it's important to understand that these elements of randomness and determinism do exist in the world. And we see them in the natural world, at least, not the things that I was talking about before with these serious mindset issues. But where we see it in the natural world is that randomness is free will. That's us exercising our own control over our lives and our decisions. And determinism, which is the irrefutable natural law that cannot be argued with and that always applies. So I've been kicking something around for a couple of days and wanted to try it out on you and see what you thought. So it's in the form of a couple of questions. First one, do you believe there is sufficient evidence to suggest the existence of natural law principles? So things that could be described as the golden rule, the universe as a mirror, the law of attraction, etc. If so, is it reasonable to suggest that we should commit significant and urgent attention to that problem if, and there's the critical word, if we actually mean what we say about our passions for freedom and sovereignty, true respect for the human individual, and so on? So that's my form of a call to action, and maybe let's hear a better explanation or a better way to put it from Manly Hall.
We sacrifice voluntarily the liberty we have earned cheerfully upon the altar of collective opinion and do exactly as we're told to. Liberty seems to be worth dying for, but not worth living with.
Magic, 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 magic. And now, Michael the Magic will attempt to escape from extreme bondage.
That is one form of magic, but probably the most pedestrian version that we know of. And if we really look at magic's true potential and what it's really about, it can be defined this way, which is, it is the science and art of influencing change to occur in accordance with the will. So magic's goal is a state of non-dualism. Well, what is non-dualism? So that's a state that exists when there is no division between my consciousness or an individual's consciousness and all else. So my consciousness is part of the universal consciousness that is creation or intelligence or energy or even God, if you want to call it that. So the first step to non-dualism is a lack of division within the self. And here we come back to that key principle of the elements of consciousness, our thoughts, emotions, and actions. And then we also incorporate left and right brain and whether or not those two are in alignment and balanced. And then we also look at the triune brain. Are we having reptilian reactions to things, right? Fight or flight for things that really don't require that level of attention and thought. Magic facilitates forces and experiences appearing that will allow for someone to learn something, perhaps an important lesson or some kind of a universal law, whatever it is. And they do so without having to experience the negative consequences of actually having gone through it. So examples of this are you learn from someone else, or it's a passed down tradition, for example, or you read about it. So will is natural law. Recall we talked about the fact that magic is trying to incorporate action in the world that's consistent with the will. Well, this is will that is the capital W will. It is natural law. It's the tendency for an event to occur based on the free will decisions that we are making. And I think that's a great definition. I just love that connection between what we are doing, not what people in our legislative houses are doing, not what bureaucrats are doing, not what our boss is doing, but what we are doing that impacts what is going on in the world. So I want to repeat that again. The will, capital W, can be described as the tendency for an event to occur based on the free will decisions that we are making, and that's synonymous with natural law. And I find it really interesting here that we are not told in that definition really what it is. What we're told is, and what's revealed to us, is how the process works. So this doesn't say go pursue X or Y, or go build this, or be this. Really, what it's saying is it's describing how the universe works. And I think that is so interesting, and I find that really all over. So many times I'll see something, and really what it is it's a description of the process, or importantly, the nature of a thing, and not just what it does or how it functions. So our higher will established itself through first principles. Now that's interesting. The higher will, big W, established itself, so came into its existence through first principles. For example, natural law principles. That's really interesting. And again, our thoughts, emotions, and actions must be in accordance with those required prerequisites, meaning that the three must be aligned with the will, the universal will, capital W will. And in a non-dualistic state, there are no justifications, there are no reasons, there are no perceptions that we can have that would interfere with the consistency of our own thoughts, emotions, and actions to create internal division. Now, I titillated the senses last week with my closing video, which was this.
Yeah, I noticed you've had a great year. Good boy. You turning that money into more money?
Are you referring to alchemy?
So here's the big reveal, and that is that magic is achieved through the vehicle of alchemy. And when we've heard of alchemy over time, at least my experience has been that it's in terms of a metals alchemist. So the guy in the lab, kind of looking like this gentleman, attempting to turn something into gold out of base metals. And by the way, I love the technology that I have, but I think that's a pretty cool scene right there. Instead of interpreting this literally, what if this were an allegory? So in an allegory, as we know, we're presented with a story that represents or embodies an important lesson, whether it's moral or otherwise, something that we're supposed to learn. But what if the alchemist is simply a person like you or me, and they're working to take a metal, so a heavy substance, that represents a weighty or conflicted consciousness, and they're trying to transmute it into a precious substance, not gold in this case, which does stand for light, but light in itself, and further than that, enlightenment. And in fact, Manly Hall had some very instructive comments about this literalist approach.
Raymond Lully, who was one of the great early alchemists, once pointed out that the great tragedy of the concept of alchemy was the transmutation of metals. Basil Valentine, monk of St. Bennet, had the same thought when he wrote into one of his books, woe to the gold makers.
One thing we have to recognize about alchemy is that there must be desire present in the individual seeking the change. In other words, the alchemist can't do this by him or herself. It requires the intent of the person that it's being acted upon. And things like magic and alchemy seem pretty out there, I get it, but they're everywhere. We can see them, for example, in hugely popular and, from what I can tell, very powerful things like Napoleon Hill and Think and Grow Rich and The Secret. And we can also see it in this fantastic quote from one of my favorites, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. And he says this: "The moment one definitely commits oneself, then providence moves too. All sorts of things occur to help one that would have never otherwise occurred. Unforeseen incidents and meetings and material assistance, which no man could have dreamed would have come his way." Now let's move forward with sorcery. And sorcery is the science and art of influencing change to occur in accordance with the will. And I know that we would typically see in our mind's eye sorcery depicted this way, but let's take a look and see if there might be something else to it. So the first logical question is, what is the difference between magic and sorcery? I read the exact same words, and it's a nuance, and it is in the word will. Recall when we talked about magic, it was in terms of the will of the universe, capital W will. But sorcery involves our will, the human will, little w, lowercase will. And so sorcery's goal is to divide and create disharmony within us. It causes a person to defy and ignore their own intuition and even what they know to be morally right. So the question becomes why? Why do we behave in this way? And the answer is this force that we call Shaitan, that we've talked about before, and had some discussions about the fact that the word that we know of as Satan is derived from Shaitan, and what is it really supposed to mean, or has that meaning been hijacked? And we've discussed the fact that Satan is this, if you want to call it an embodiment, or at least a materialization for a lot of people of this force of evil, and we hold that up against this definition of Shaitan, which we know to be a mindset, but something that resides within us, not outside of us like the devil or Satan, but this thing that's dwelling within us. I think it's pretty interesting. So we're driven by fear, and this is critical. When I talked before about in our opening comments, we have to understand that we have frailties and we have weaknesses as human beings, and those aren't necessarily negatives, they're just how we're made. But the critical thing to do is to understand how they interact in the world, how they interact with other human beings, and to refine that and to gain a greater understanding rather than pass those responsibilities to a third party to manage for us. So sorcery is accomplished by illusion and manipulation. So think media, think propaganda, think poisonous worldviews. And sorcery is the concept that is being harnessed in some of these concepts I've talked about before, like propaganda, advertising, schooling, media, religious fundamentalism, and scientism. And while I'm on the topic of scientism, I goofed up last week and I actually had some content that I forgot to put in, so I wanted to include these definitions of scientism. So the first definition I got from my Oxford English Dictionary. My wife was kind enough to have bought me a compact version of that fairly recently that I absolutely love. And it defines scientism as the habit and mode of expression of a man of science. And that was it. There was no further explanation. Then we fast forward to the dictionary I bought when I was in high school, and it was, well, I don't know that I bought it, it was bought for me, Webster's Ninth New Collegiate Dictionary, and it has two definitions now. First, methods and attitudes typical of or attributed to the natural scientists, so similar to the OED. And then it adds this, interestingly, an exaggerated trust in the efficacy of the methods of natural science applied to all areas of investigation, as in philosophy, the social sciences, and the humanities. So a very interesting addition there, in my opinion, certainly seems to indicate that something was going on, because I presume that these definitions are changed by things that are being discussed in public, or the way words are being used, etc. So it seems to me that something was going on about this exaggerated trust, which is exactly what I'm talking about. So just wanted to point that out. So what results from all of this are beliefs. And beliefs are something that we are very attached to and are very important to us. We will blindly defend our beliefs, and in fact, very sadly, a lot of people will die clinging to beliefs, and even ones that they didn't come up with on their own. They're simply inherited. They were taught that. They thought that because somebody else said it. Rarely do people actually go about questioning their own beliefs, and I think that's a pretty sad statement. So this is ego at work and on display. It's the lower self. It's the ego-identified self. It's the identification of self with something else outside of us. And this is not aligned with will, universal will, the capital W will, but with the lowercase will, the will of the self. My perception is my reality. It's my will. And will operates, this is universal will that is, operates in alignment with natural law principles, objective morality, and truth. And I would say that the most recognizable application of sorcery is this. Let's close today's discussion with some final thoughts from Manly Hall on the power and intention of alchemy.
But in any event, when you get to this level, you begin to work with the chemistry and alchemy of life. It is no longer little materials in bottles. It is vast concepts experienced within the unfolding massiveness of human projection. Little by little, the entire mystery goes on until finally the individual, from an intuitive procedure, forms a reunion with the divine part of himself. And having made this union with the divine part of himself, he then goes on to the further steps of the great transmutations. He finds himself gradually lifted up into the hierarchies of life, but never, however, for personal gain, never for glory, never for wealth, and never to escape pain. Because gradually he sees that alchemy is only a symbolic representation of the entire process of universal activity.
Thanks for being with me. Until next time, be well, and remember, do your own thinking.